of other party-related things, but those are the two things that I would highlight now. So we're going to go after changing elections and electoral outcomes through primaries. The second thing is we're going to work to shrink the federal government. Now, how in the world can we do that? There is only one force on the face of the earth powerful enough to shrink the federal government. Only one. There's no foreign entity that's big enough. China can't shrink the federal government. Europe can't do it. There's only one. It is the combined power of the individual states. That's it. If all 50 states get together, we can shrink the size of the federal government. So what are we doing to facilitate that? We've got a different group called the Hancock Committee for the States, and we're basically replicating what we're doing in Texas everywhere else in the nation. We will not be ready in 2010, but we will be ready in 2012. We're going to basically set up a private political party in every single state controlled by the people in the states, not by some national group. It's bottom up. Our objective is then to essentially demand that the federal government constrain its growth through a series of structural reforms I'll talk about in a second, in 4 categories. Now, you may say, well, the federal government could just ignore you, right? But the states do possess the political equivalent of a nuclear weapon, which is the ability to call a constitutional convention. Now, I do not believe that we will end up having to call a constitutional convention. The last time a group of federal legislators got together and decided that it was a good idea to call a constitutional convention was 1787. And when they were done, the whole Constitution had been rewritten and all those guys were out of a job. They will not let that happen. Before we're done, though, they will do exactly what we want them to do. Because if they don't, that's the alternative. But the mere possession of that powerful an instrument by the states in an organized fashion is enough to force the Congress to move. It's going to take that. The federal government is a monopoly of a scale unheard of in human history. And no monopoly in the history of mankind has reformed itself from within. Ever. Think back. The Romans. No. Europe. Britain. Any major hegemonic power, any monopoly, only reforms when there's an external threat. And that external threat here is ironically from within, from the states. That's our second piece. The third is when we do this, we want to get it fixed right? You could think about what's going on as the third phase of American governance, right? The first phase was a phase that ran basically from before the Articles of Confederation up to 1787, which was sort of a first attempt at creating some kind of federal government. Then we had the Constitution, 1789 to basically 1890, about 100 years. During that time period, what ended up happening was we had very powerful states. We had a relatively weak federal government. It was strong enough to beat the most powerful naval nation on earth in Britain in 1812. So this was, this was a good constitution. Then in 1890, we went through a series of progressive era reforms, many of which were good, right? There were upgrades in this, right? Universal suffrage is a good thing. It really is. Guys, trust me, this is a good thing. Better applaud or your wife is going to be mad at you. Universal suffrage, antitrust legislation, anti-corruption legislation. These are good, right? The problem was we sowed the seeds for basically a creeping growth in the federal system. So we have to fix that. And when we fix that, there are 4 major areas that we need to concentrate on. The first one is fiscal reform, right? We need to restrain spending and we need to restrain taxation. Right? And those need to be in balance. We need to have a consumption-based tax instead of a production-based tax. Right? As a nation, we become a nation of consumers, not producers. If you tax something, you get less of it. And if you don't tax it, you get more of it. We should have less consumption, more production, so we should tax consumption. And only consumption, not consumption and production. An income tax and a VAT is a terrible idea, but it's coming. This is the next big wave, and we'll have to fight that. But we have to get our fiscal house in order, and entitlement reform is key to that. It's absolutely key. The second piece of the second category of reform that has to be taken on is electoral reform. We have to make elections competitive again, right? Competitive elections increase public participation, increase turnout. The stakes are raised, and people show up. We need our political system to be competitive. There are so many constraints. I'll name a few. The gerrymander. We got to get rid of the gerrymander. It's ludicrous, right? We need to impose term limits, right? We need a term limit. We need to term limit congressmen, representatives, senators, and federal judges, including the Supreme Court, right? These are systemic changes that will allow continuous renewal within our governance system. They're not targeted in any individual group. There are situations where term limits will hurt Republicans, and some where they'll hurt Democrats. We don't care. Not my problem, right? What we want is a healthy governance system. So, electoral reform is crucial for our nation's long-term health. The third piece is regulatory reform. The federal government preempts a tremendous amount of state discretion on the basis of one clause, the Commerce Clause, right? And it has so expanded that clause as to cover just about everything. We need to remove that bias towards federal legislation. We need to remove the preemption principle and let states do their regulatory job. That is a core constitutional principle. Now, why should we do that? The reason is because the feedback loop between the regulator and the regulated is much smaller, much closer, right? If they're here, if they're living among us, right? And so when it comes back to the states, we think it should actually go further, and it should come to the counties. It should come to the cities. Most regulation can be done that way. It's interesting. The building industry that I spend most of my life in is a very large part of the economy. It's a $1 trillion piece of the economy. Land use regulation is governed almost entirely at the local level. There's a national model code that's written by a nonprofit organization, not by the government, and then it's adopted by individual states and counties. It is a great model for the way the system should work. Not a top-down mandate, but a group coming together to establish some standards that sort of make sense so that you can get some efficiencies, but then it's adopted at the local level and customized to local conditions. The fourth piece is influence reform. We have got to gut the lobby and the rent-seeking corporations who take advantage of this concentrated political power. Now, we're still developing our specific agenda on this, and some of this may not happen, but my personal favorite idea on this is Congress is 535 people in staff. Why do they have to be, in the 21st century, in this period of jet flight and digital communications, in Washington, D.C.? Why? That's 535 people. They fit in this square. Why don't they go on the road? Why don't they meet in a different state every year?